Okay, welcome. So as you can probably tell, I'm not Pippa Brewer. I will do my best to stand in. Pippa is on a story, scoop to follow. I will take the role as chair instead. She sends her apologies. My name is Harry Pinner. I'm Director of Policy and Politics at IPPR. And we are the UK's progressive think tank, and we're delighted to be hosting this event in partnership with our friends in-house. We're delighted you've all joined us here today for this conversation. Couldn't be a more exciting and timely moment to be having it, and we've got an absolutely amazing panel to talk us through what's happening. So 9 days to go till the general election. I spoke to an unnamed advisor today who said the Ming vase feels more fragile day by day. So let's see if they can carry across the line. And our panel is here to tell us whether that will happen and what will happen on the other side of July the 4th. So we will have some opening remarks from each of our panel, starting with John to tell us a bit about what's the state of the polls and what he thinks will happen. And we'll then speak to Katie and to Jonathan about respectively what it means for the Conservatives and for the Labour Party, and Karis to talk a bit about the policy landscape and what it means for the future of the country. So without further ado, I think we should kick off. I would like to invite Sir John Curtis, Professor of Politics at the University of and
you know better than that.
Pollster Supremo, to say a few words about what we have learned throughout the campaign about the polls, where you think it's heading, what are the things we should be looking out for. Over to you, John.
Sure. So if we take the average of the opinion polls that were conducted since the Monday of last week, and you always need to remember that the opinion polls are always giving you a certain amount of a real view window. But the reason for doing that far back is that maximizes the number of polls that you can cover relatively recently, and every polling company is polling at least once a week. So if you take that average, we are looking at the moment at Labour 40, Conservative 20, Reform 17, Liberal Democrat 11, Greens on 6. The only really significant development in this campaign was Nigel Farage's decision to enter the race. The first 2 weeks of the campaign, there was absolutely no movement at all, and I thought we were heading for a pretty boring campaign. But Nigel Farage has brightened things up a bit. And basically, reform, this was the fact that nothing happened in the first 2 weeks was actually crucial, because it meant that support for the smaller parties was not being squeezed. Above all, support for the Brexit Party, for the Reform Party, was not being squeezed. So that by the time Farage intervened, support for reform was already higher than it had been for Brexit Party at the same stage in the 2019 campaign. So I suspect Farage reckoned, therefore, it was not such a silly thing to get involved after all. So basically, since then, Farage's arrival initially added 3 points to the reform total, and it's now running on average about 6 points higher. In the wake of this, it therefore means that the Conservatives, whose first job was to squeeze the reform vote to get any chance of being able to narrow the lead on Labour, have failed to achieve that objective, and therefore, rather than progressing during this campaign, their support is 4 points down on average as to where it was on the 22nd of May. Not that this campaign has been straightforward for Labour. Labour support is also down by 4 points. Now, some of this may be to do with methodological changes that some of the pollsters are engaged in, and Patrick English, I see to my far right, can explain what YouGov have been up to. And it may also, to some extent, and there's other evidence which I come back to, that there is some tactical sorting going on between Labour and Liberal Democrat voters, and that may also be part of the story. But in the case of the Conservative Party, it's perfectly clear what's happening. The proportion of people who are going from Conservative to Reform is now almost twice the proportion of going from Conservative to Labour. And Reform are the principal problem the Conservatives face. And the polling evidence, again from YouGov, so I'm not advertising Patrick really, the polling evidence from YouGov indicates quite clearly that basically Reform voters will not be persuaded on the vote Farage, get Starmer argument. They frankly, some of them want us to bring the Conservative House down. And they just regarded Conservative government as just as bad as Labour government, so therefore that argument doesn't wash, and it hasn't washed. Like so many other things, the pollsters could have told the Conservative Party about their strategy if they'd been willing to listen about 9 months ago. But anyway, I won't go into all of that. The interest of this election, therefore, in part is about reform and the impact of that. And I think one thing we should say straight away, because I think this election, well, it's going to leave its mark on British politics. Quite that mark is going to be is open to question. But one thing is to bear in mind that if the polls are currently right on average, we are heading for the smallest share of the vote being won by Conservative and Labour combined since 1922, since the arrival of the Labour Party. So we're back to the fracturing of British politics, and it's already the case that that's what's happened organisationally. This is the first election in which 5 political parties have fought virtually every constituency. So although we are focusing on the Labour lead and what Labour might achieve in terms of a House of Commons seats, and I'll come to that in a moment, we should bear in mind that underneath the surface, we are seeing a significant fracturing of British politics in place. So the other drama of the campaign, partly again contributed by Mr. English, and I will stop mentioning you after this, Patrick, have been the numerous multiple regression and post-stratification polls, which have been greeted with a certain amount of scepticism, which is a combination of, oh, surely not, and look, they say completely different things. They are not saying completely different things, and you should take them seriously, which in Labour's case is kind of good news. What they are all showing is what the local elections showed at the beginning of May, which is what last year's local elections showed, which is that support for the Conservative Party is going down more heavily in places where they were previously strongest. In part, this is simply an arithmetic inevitability. If the Conservative vote is down by 25 points, there are around 100 constituencies where the Conservative Party did not get 25% of the vote last time. So therefore, it is impossible for the Conservative vote to go down by 25 points in these constituencies. Ergo, it must be going down more elsewhere, i.e. places where they were previously strongest. So this is partly a question of simple arithmetic. It's partly a question, however, of the legacy of Nigel Farage's decision back in 2019 to pull his candidates out of Conservative held constituencies. So therefore, anything that Reform achieve is plus on zero. And basically what the MRP polls will show is the Reform vote is going up most heavily in Conservative held constituencies as compared with Brexit in 2019. And again, so in other words, Reform are just doing most damage where you might expect. The disagreement amongst the MRP pollsters is just how strong this relationship is. And that is where the uncertainty lies. And, you know, to give you some idea, I was on a panel last night with James Kanagasuriam, who invented the Red Wall, and Matt Singh, who spotted that the polls were getting it wrong in 2015. And we basically all agreed we at the moment would believe any figure for the Conservatives between about 50 and 150. And where it will lie within that range, we frankly do not know. But it does look as though it's going to be relatively low. Let me then say one other thing and I'll shut up. The first is that we may also be heading for our most disproportional election result ever, but with some rather unusual twists. So basically, one of the things that progressives like yourselves have tended to tell yourself over the years is that one of the problems with the electoral system is that the right is united behind the Conservative Party, whereas Labour and the Democrats divide the vote between them, and the Democrats in particular lose out from the electoral system. You may now have to rewrite the script. Some of the MRP polling is indicating that the Democrats may indeed get 11 or 12% of the votes and not be discriminated against by the electoral system at all. Rather, what the electoral system looks going to do, if the MRP polls were at all right, is to discriminate fiercely against the right. The Conservative Party is probably going to get, depending on whether it's 50 or 150, but it's probably going to get less than its proportionate share, which, you know, that would be a record. And equally, however, of course, Reform are likely to be scuppered by the system. Which all of this, for some of us, raises the interesting question as to what will be the attitude of a Labour Party, which is committed to electoral reform in the light of such a result. And I will be interested to see what answers I get in this room.
Thank you, John. And there's quite a few follow-ups that I'm sure I've definitely got. I'm sure the audience will as well, so we'll come back to you on some of that in a moment. Jonathan, I'm going to come to you next. Could you tell us a bit about your take on what happens next? You were obviously there in 1977, helped steward New Labour into government, and then I think you were there for the almost entirety of the Blair era. The longest standing, the last standing. So I'd be interested in your take on what you're expecting, how you're expecting Labour to govern, what the challenges are they're going to face.
Yeah, I'll just make 3 points about what might happen after the election. I'm just picking up on John's point about proportional representation. Of course, in 97, we'd been engaged in secret talks with Paddy Ashdown about exactly that. And the idea was that after election, we would form a coalition of some sort with the Lib Dems. And then on election day, Paddy Ashdown called up, and both Paddy Ashdown and Tony Blair chickened out of doing that because it was clear the size majority we were going to get. Tony couldn't sell it to the Labour Party, and Paddy Ashdown didn't want to be eaten for breakfast by a large Labour Party. So, and then we had the commission under Roy Jenkins looking at AV basically, and that went nowhere, got nowhere. So that's the problem for a party. When you win big, then no one much wants to do it.
Exactly. But some of us are old enough to remember when there was an active campaign for electoral reform inside the Conservative Party in the late 70s and early 1980s. I look forward to revival.
You'll actually get revived at the same time. The two parties. The 2 points will make a one about the size of majority, the so-called supermajority. I mean, those again of you who are old enough to remember John Biffin saying that a large majority for the Tory party on Mrs. Thatcher would be disastrous and being slapped down at the time. My experience of 3 terms in government is quite good to have a large majority because then revolt's much easier to handle. It doesn't actually make things worse for you. There is a problem, of course, if you have 400 MPs and 100 jobs, because then there are going to be 300 discontented MPs at any one time. So that makes it difficult to manage, but doesn't make it's certainly better than the alternative of having very small groups able to make your life difficult. I think the problem will come for the Labour Party in that because it's run a very cautious campaign, hasn't set out a very it won't have a very clear positive mandate for what it's going to do. It'll have a negative mandate that everyone hates the Tories, wants to get rid of the Tories. But the danger of having running a defensive campaign is how do you then get yourself to a second term and a third term, which was of course what worried us in 97, how we would get to that. And the accusations of betrayal and the threat of the soft left will come over time. But basically those sort of rebellions are, in my experience, a function of how long you've been in power. They don't happen at the beginning. You've got a huge amount of political capital, and that's why you need to use your political capital from the beginning if you possibly can. The second point I wanted to make was about what you actually do in government. Most of governing is responding to crises, in the words of Macmillan, events here by events, and so you find yourself just reacting. It is a good idea to have some priorities because otherwise you won't move anything down the pike as you're working on it. My estimation, the most you can get through one parliament would be 3 priorities, try and actually focus on 3 things that you could do. And what you should do is do it very early on. When we came in 1997, we changed Prime Minister's questions. It used to be 2 Prime Minister's questions a week, 15 minutes each. We changed that to 1 of half an hour so the Prime Minister could travel around the country. Otherwise, you're stuck in London for the whole week. And had we tried to do that 6 months after coming into office, there's no way we would have got it through. But by doing it straight away, you can actually make those sort of changes. The mistake we made, I think, was not using that political capital early enough on public sector reform. We were so nervous about this blasted vase that's been carried for so many years that we were terrified we wouldn't get to a second term. If we did something radical, we would lose the party. Actually, we'd be better off making those changes early on and then having the results of them to benefit us later on. We spent a lot of time talking in government about this awful experience of being post-euphoria and pre-delivery. And it seemed like it was like 5 years between the two. And you do get trapped in this position in government and you need to think about it early on. So this government, for example, the government to come, I hope, not this government, will need to do something fairly radical fairly quickly. I would have thought on planning or something like that to demonstrate that it really can change things. The third and last point I wanted to talk about was just transition. We do have in this country a completely bonkers system. Unless you've lived it, it's really hard to realise how bonkers it is. In the United States, you have more than 3 months of transition after the election before you come into government. Most European countries, you have a negotiation on a coalition, you have time to prepare. In our system, I remember from 97, we were up in Tony's constituency. The result was about 2 or 3 in the morning. We flew down, went to Elizabeth Hall for the celebrations. I walked back across the bridge, went to my flat. We had to be up at 7, went to Islington to meet Tony there, went to the palace to kiss hands and come in. You have to appoint the cabinet in 2 days. The Prime Minister is completely exhausted. He's confronted by a cabinet secretary asking him to make decisions about what he's going to do on the missiles, on the submarines, nuclear missiles, just when he's most exhausted and unable to make a decision. He then has to appoint the cabinet, appoint the junior ministers, and because the Queen's speech, at least in those days, was printed on goatskin, you've got to actually have it ready 3 days before it's delivered. So you've got maybe 6 days to prepare the Queen's speech. So you are really asking something almost impossible of exhausted politicians after a long campaign like this. There's never going to change it, but that's what we have. But they have to have in hand is a 100-day plan. And it'd be a bit different this time because the date of the election, you've got the whole of August. So what you'll have essentially is 1 month. You'll have 2-3 weeks of Parliament, and then people will go into recess. So at least they've got a chance to rethink. What will happen is they'll lose momentum as a result. What you want at the back of an election is to go straight into something like Bank of England independence, something major that shows the direction you're going to go in. In their case, they'll have just those 3 weeks to do it, and that, much of which will be taken up with foreign affairs because they'll have to have the NATO summit, the EPC, and then you've got Cheltenham after summer. So it's going to be really very difficult for them to do that. So think about machinery of government changes because you want to make those straight away. The 5 boards they're talking about for the pledges, 5 mission boards. And that needs thinking about. You think about the personnel, how you're going to get the right people into the jobs to do it. So and of course Sue Gray is a big advantage from that point of view because she has experience at the central government, unlike me, and she from before, and she has the opportunity to do this, but it is an incredibly difficult thing to do, and if it goes wrong, they will suffer. If
you were advising them to put the rabbit out of the hat at the Bank of England independence moment, where would you point them towards?
Well, you do actually have to have prepared the rabbit before, so I have no idea what they've prepared. And if they had told me, it would be a surprise. But they, I think given how long it takes to actually implement things, I would have an announcement that has real impact straight away. That's why I said planning would be the sort of thing I would do. Something I'd really try and make it clear I'm serious about making a difficult decision on planning. I'm going to do something that previous governments haven't done. That might work. Excellent. Katie, you're chair of in-house communications, but you were formerly director of communications for Theresa May. You have the unenviable job on this panel of saying what's going to happen to the Tories next, yeah, what you think the next few years holds for the Conservative Party.
Well, it's really interesting. Thank you for partnering with us on this wonderful event, because it's great to have you here in your room today. It's interesting because when I speak to friends inside the Labour Party, some of whom used to work here in-house, they say to me, "Oh, you're about to go through what we went through," and it was grim. They were grim times. You do come through that on the other side, but you don't know how long that's going to take. So let's start first of all with what's going to happen with Rishi Sunak. Well, I'm pretty confident that his future does not lie in the backbenches in the way Theresa May did. I would imagine if he holds on to his seat, and that is a big if, more likelihood is the seat goes and he does decide to go abroad and set up a different life there. So what happens is we have a smooth, lovely, controlled handover in terms of the Conservative Party, or does he cut and run and go, and then we have a caretaker potentially for a summer or a couple of months. And then we look forward to party conference season, where hilariously the Conservative Party decided that they would sew up all their conference contracts before they called an election at the highest price possible. So if you see me grumpy at Conservative contracts, because I've had my pants down basically on the price. But what you can't blame them at that scenario. So we go to party conference probably with some kind of leadership contest, some kind of roadshowy type thing. Who's in that contest is going to be, we can predict, but do they hold on to their seats? The Penny Mordaunt in Portsmouth North, we're not quite sure she's going to hold on to a seat. Some of those big ticket seats where you would normally think 20 something plus are really, really worried because of some of the things you talked about earlier. Yeah. Very worried about whether or not they keep us the seat. And therefore, because we don't know whether or not it's going to be 50 or 150, and by the way, I met a senior cabinet minister last night at the American Embassy Party who said to me, "I think we're on for 200. And I said, "Don't you think that's optimistic thinking?" He said, No, we're on for 200. fantasy. But that's bed. Don't worry, I didn't believe it for a minute, but let him kind of live the dream. But we don't know what that makeup's going to be, because if we don't quite know where it's going to, the axis is going to fall, we don't quite know what the makeup in terms of, you know, the demographics of that new cohort of Conservative MPs will be. And we don't know if they match the membership, but we do know what the membership's like. And we do know that membership is hemorrhaging to support to reform. You will speak to Conservative candidates who will tell you no one's coming out, no one's giving any money, no one's delivering leaflets, no one's willing to knock on doors. They've kind of vanished somewhat. So there is a real kind of problem with not only were they an ageing supporter base, but they're not, you know, not wanting to turn out. No donors coming forward. So this is a really stark situation where you don't have any money, you don't have any voter base to, you know, to come out and support you. So we don't know if a new leader will match the membership. And of course, the current rules, as you know from before, because we've been here a few times recently, is that the MPs have to choose the last two, and then it goes to the membership. And of course, it may well be that the views of MPs, whoever's left in Parliament, are very different from Conservative Party membership. And it's slightly, you know, handbags at dawn scenario. So look forward to that. So then you've got this the situation of whoever's left, the handful that are left, how they bring together a shadow cabinet, how they try to hold a government to account, with Farage probably in Parliament giving the Conservative Party just as much grief as a new Labour administration. So they don't just have one opposition, they have two. Plus the party will then start to really crumble behind the scenes. There is about to be a fight for the heart and soul of the Conservative Party, for sure. And this has been coming since Brexit. This has been a long time coming. And whilst Rishi Sunak has not covered himself in glory, you've got to probably argue that this has been coming since Partygate, since Liz Truss. You know, he can't really take responsibility for everything. And so, you know, I don't envy him, and I didn't much fancy that gig. So why they all fought for it, I don't know. Because I think it was always going to end badly. They were always going to lose, but possibly not by this much. And that's a decision of timing, that's a decision of structure, and you know what's happened since. So I don't suppose it's going to be pretty, or it's going to sort itself out easily. And I can see the party trading through a few leaders in the first couple of years, you know, 15-month stint, and then you're on to the next one, 15-month stint, you're on to the next one.
The last few years.
Yeah, quite. But I remember the times of William Hague in Duncan Smith, actually in the building opposite where I sit right now, and Joyce times, Michael Howard, you know, you plough through a new leader in the hope that something might change, and it didn't. And I think that the Conservative Party is potentially facing that forward. But that also depends on how smooth Keir Starmer's honeymoon period is, and how quickly people get either lose momentum or get slightly bored, or soft left start coming forward with plans and proposals and pushing minority voices and campaign groups forward, and suddenly Labour Party caves into them, and all, you know, you've got a member of the public that you're not quite sure, do they then feel that Reform have got something going on enough to support them and to add to that support, or do they think that, you know, Farage will now have an opportunity to ask questions at PMQs, he will now be able to speak to the media all the time, he will be showboating for Britain in Parliament, and that either turns people off because they think it's a one-trick pony, or they start to flock towards Reform. So I can't guarantee right now that even if the Conservative Party sorts themselves out and finds the right leader, they have serious competition, which I've not really faced before. So we are now in a scenario, I think, where it's going to take some real time, and people don't have patience for time in politics. They won't have patience, by the way, with the new Labour government either. And so which is why I refer to a short honeymoon period and potentially problems. And I know you sort of say about, Jonathan, about a big majority, actually, you can quash that quite well with lots of supporters. I also think that if you have no decent opposition, you start to turn on yourselves a little bit, rather than remembering the opposition is in the green benches opposite rather than behind you. And politicians are fickle, they don't remember that the party leader was the one that got them there. If you think of the journey that Keir Starmer has taken the Labour Party on, away from Corbyn, getting rid of anti-Semitism, all the kind of things that he's done to get the party to this point, they'll probably forget that in about 5 minutes flat and start causing all kinds of problems for their own particular causes and constituencies, because that's what MPs do. And empowered MPs with big majorities do that too. So, but I don't think the Conservative Party will be any fit state soon to hold them to account. So I'd love to be able to tell you that this is just a nasty blip and all will be sorted soon for the benefit of democracy, actually. But I don't think we are there yet, and I think it's going to be quite some time. And we're going to plough through a couple of leaders before the Conservative Party starts to sort itself out with no money.
How likely is it that you think the Conservatives pivot off wildly to the right, as in either through Farage in some way, or by the membership getting their way and it being a kind of further right candidate that wins that?
I think it's got real potential, and every sane Conservative that I know is deeply, deeply worried about it. And so it will very much depend on not just who the next party leader is, but the strength of support that party leader has, and also their firm belief in Conservative Party values, and that you do not win from the right, you win from the centre. And I've seen David Frost and others, Lord Frost and others recently say, never again should you think you win from the centre. And I was kind of like, okay, fine, this is where it starts. And so you potentially we will end up with a Conservative leader that not everyone is happy with, but is bold enough to keep Farage at bay. Because a weak choice of a leader will probably roll over and have their belly stickled, and that's probably a worry that lots of sane Conservatives worry about.
So, there are 4 seats at the front if anyone who's standing is getting tired. I'm going to come to Karis Roberts, Executive Director at IPR now, and talk a bit about the policy agenda and what comes next.
Thanks, Harry. I will come to the policy agenda of what comes next, but I think it's potentially interesting to start with a reflection on the election campaign and what policies have been coming up. I'm going to quote you go again, which might start getting boring, mightn't it? But I think
You have to sponsor us next time.
so at the beginning of the campaign, cost of living was shown to be the key issue that everybody was thinking about and that people wanted answers to. And things like health, the economy, immigration were prominent but were much lower. And I think one of the interesting things to look at is actually research from Loughborough University that's analysed where the election debate has gone. And the issue that has come up time and time again is tax. It comes up in the media debate twice as often as the economy more broadly. And I think that's interesting in terms of what the very public debate doesn't always track what voters actually care about, and I think that matters for how we think about the policy going forwards. Why has there been that focus on tax? Well, partly because the Conservatives have been desperate to frame it as a tax election, and I actually think have been quite successful in doing so, with a bit of help from the Daily Mail. And Labour have been pretty desperate to avoid talking about tax and where that might need to go. And that's left lots of people kind of questioning, well, what is the agenda that comes next? I think they've answered that pretty roundly through a 130-page manifesto. Anyone who accuses them of not having policy should take a look at that document, because there's certainly a lot of policy in there. And there's a lot that is going to be quite challenging for them to deliver. Obviously, a manifesto can't contain all the details of how something's going to be delivered, but it's certainly quite ambitious. In particular, you have the kind of the missions, which are put forward as the key things that they want to achieve, with growth as the kind of the top mission, and then the kind of clean energy probably being the one that most kind of ties into that growth mission. And you see lots of policies in there, which often reflect work that IPPR had done in the past, looking at, for example, a green prosperity plan and how a green industrial policy can drive growth across the country. A big focus on planning and housing, as we've heard, and on making things like childcare work, and kind of taken together. This is what Rachel Reeves calls the securonomics or modern supply side economics agenda. Undergirding that is a big focus on stability. And while I think some people treat this as something of a kind of slogan, I actually do think it's quite meaningful in a world in which we've had multiple chances of the exchequer, multiple plans for growth. I think there's some debate about whether it's 10 or 11 in recent years. And so there's a kind of focus on really bolstering institutions that can govern economic policy making and having stability to encourage business investment. As I said, I think this is a really ambitious agenda, and it's one that's going to need a lot of kind of careful thought about how to deliver. But coming back to where we started, I do think there are some remaining questions for Labour that will hit them pretty hard when they're actually in government. And that's partly about the things that might come up. I don't think anyone was predicting a pandemic at the stage of the last election. But there are all sorts of very challenging things to deal with, such as how we do the net zero transition in a way that doesn't bolster the Nigel Farage's of this world and does do the transition fairly. And public services are absolutely on their knees. So we did some analysis, I think Harry did it, demonstrating that even if you achieved the fastest rates of improvement to public services that were achieved under the new Labour government, it would still take a decade to bring public services back to where they were in 2010. That is an absolutely enormous challenge for any government to be grappling with. And frankly, while there might be a choice to kind of pin everything on growth, and I do think that you can definitely get the growth rate up of the UK economy, I think that there will come a point where they will need to think about that tax question. And that's probably the kind of unanswered aspect of this election campaign.
Excellent. Well, huge thank you to our panel. I'm now going to open up to the floor to ask some questions. We'll take a couple at a time. If you can just say very briefly who you are, and what your question is. The questions rather than statements, please. The lady on the left here in the blonde hair, there's a microphone coming towards you. There we go.
Hi, my name is Rose Beacon. I'm the head of Reform. Thanks, not the party, just absolutely. I have a question on policy and the transition into government. There'll be a lot of MPs coming into government, coming into Parliament that have never been MPs before. There'll be lots of MPs coming into government that have never been ministers before. Given the complex fiscal context and this desire to be radical quite fast if they need to, in order to be politically successful in the next election, how does Labour or have governments in the past gone about upskilling ministers? Obviously, it's like a tantamount to running a large organisation, but also public sector reform actually is quite a specific discipline. It's all about efficiencies, costings, effectiveness, trade-offs, all of those things, but actually, which political campaigning doesn't necessarily always teach you. Is there anyone in the current Labour cabinet or in coming into potentially into new government that might transform into Labour's version of Michael Gove, the master deliverer, really good at moving between departments? What does policy delivery look like that first year for all of those ministers that might be competing for very tight resources from Rachel Reeves?
Thank you. And the gentleman to the left.
I'm Ben Stafford, I'm from WWF. I suppose coming back slightly to Caris's point, how do we do election campaigns better? I mean, I'm as interested in opinion poll as the next person, but this campaign has been sort of dominated by polls and D-Day and various other things. But you might argue that when it comes to making the difficult net zero transition in the years to come, the public might feel they haven't really had a great deal of debate on it in this campaign. So maybe I'm being naive, and perhaps given that parties partly control the way in which they want campaigns to happen, we're not going to get there, but I'd be interested in the panel's views on how we have a better policy debate. And just a very quick one for Katie, does anybody actually want to be the leader of the Conservative Party? I sort of reflect that William Hague probably stuck at his chances of becoming Prime Minister by running for Tory leader after Tony Blair won a huge majority. So will there be a real battle to have that position? Is it like the cockerel on the top of the dung heap, or might some people stand back?
I'll take two more if we've got them. The lady here and the gentleman just here.
Hi, I'm Steph, and still from Arab. I had a question about the mayors. Obviously we've got a big raft of new Labour mayors, which is very exciting. But what do we think that sort of tension will be, if any, on kind of policy from central government? And might we see some drama? But it's a question.
And gentlemen just behind.
Hi there, Paul Owen from Spy Healthcare. I'm just wondering what your thoughts on what turnout might be, and then how worried are Labour about potentially really low turnout, and then ultimately some of those people finding a home in reform somewhere down the track.
Great. Coming on any of them, but I might direct them a bit as well. So, John, if you want to take turnout first.
Yeah, my expectation is that turnout's going to be relatively low. Partly based on evidence, the decline in turnout in parliamentary by-elections in this parliament was in the end just short of what it was in the 1997 to 2001 parliament, which ended in a 59% turnout. Otherwise, two conditions which were present in 2001 are present now. One is, it seems to be all over by the shouting. Two, not much difference between the two principal protagonists. To which I think we can add three. Neither of the two party, well, actually, none of the party leaders are very good at politics. None of them have been able to craft a synoptic message that gives them an idea of what kind of country they want to create. They are both of them far too immersed in detail. Meanwhile, the levels, as I was writing 10 days ago, the levels of trust and confidence in politicians in general is pretty low, and the public are pretty sceptical about whether the party is going to be able to deliver quite a lot of what they say they're promising. So, to be honest, if it's a nice fine day like today, I can see many Conservative voters going, you know what, that's such a show. And I can't really vote for Starmer. I've got Farage. No, surely not. Let's go to the beach. And equally, on the Labour side, it's all very wishy-washy. Starmer doesn't appeal. Might vote Green, but a bit of a wasted vote. Oh, okay, let's go to the beach. And I suspect, and the implication of that answer is probably affect both parties relatively equally, because you can see how neither party is really motivating people so far as being enthusiastic about rate of people's concern.
Katie, I might come to you, obviously on the direct question about does anyone want the poison chalice of Tory leadership, but also giving you a director of communications. And I think, do you help run Boris's campaign? Yeah. I'd be interested in your views on whether we should be thinking differently about how we do campaigning in order to have more of a debate in this country.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating. I'm a cynic in politics because I chase headlines at number 10 and I decided to collect my headlines for a while in kind of just a straightforward document and then ask for a tracker across government to see what we could then go back on 3, 6, 9 months later to be able to say, we said this on this date, we've come back and there's a whole series of KPIs in that department, we're all doing this. And I've got some more news for you that we've made. No one's tracking those. And it made me feel really kind of like we were just pumping out these stories in the hope that you would read them and be really happy about them. And we'd feed you and we'd feed the lobby, which I have some real, talking, Jonathan, of being really bold early on, not many Western democracies brief their media as many times a week as we do. And I tried to reduce that and it went down like a bucket of cold sick. And heaven say I did not get my own.
Good job to this part here, isn't it?
They said to me, you're restricting our right to question you and hold you to account and scrutiny. I said, no, the whole building is centred on answering you twice a day. Actually, we should be thinking about what people in Hull and Ramsgate care about rather than just what people across the road care about in the lobby, as much as they are my close, friends and contacts. So, who wants to be the leader of the Conservative Party? Well, more people than you might think, because every politician thinks that they're the ones that are going to be able to change things. They're the ones. Everybody else is doing it wrong. They're the ones going to do it right. So there's an absolute core self-belief that some of us maybe don't have, and that's why we're not running for parliament. So absolutely. Secondly, there aren't that many chances left in politics to make your mark, make your name, have a legacy. And what's this all for if it's not to try and get the top job? And therefore, if you can't get the top job in number 10, you might as well try and, make your name for yourself as the one that, led the comeback, build your own legacy that way. So there is something around, oh, am I really going to be a backbench MP for the next 5 or 10 years, not doing very much? Or am I going to be, the one that you will talk about in a positive way? So there are more people that want it than you might think. And there will be a collection of people who are all kind of doing the rounds and helping out other people right now and making supportive phone calls and sending supportive text messages and things. There'll be a lot of run to writers, I think.
Jonathan, I might come to you on upskilling ministers. You obviously had a similar situation when you came in, which is that Labour have been out of power for a long time, so there's very few people who'd done those jobs previously. What would you be advising, and I imagine you might well be advising privately to Labour to do with their new couple of ministers and advisors as well?
Well, they've done it to a certain extent. So in 97, we've been out of power for 18 years. So there was almost no one, like Jack Cunningham and one other, were the only people who'd been ministers before. So there was no experience of ministerial office and very little experience of running anything at all. So we set up a rather sort of Keith Robinson type system of trying to prepare them for it. Patricia Hewitt got some consultants in, Tessa Blackstone got some academics, but a bunch of retired permanent secretary ran a course for them. Some, John Prescott wouldn't come, Gordon Brown wouldn't come, but mostly others came. And I think it helped them because they got to meet a real live ex-permanent secretary and see what they're like and realise their job isn't to run the department, it's to try and run the policy. They're not the personnel manager of the department. So it was pretty useful. This time I think they'd be much more professional about it. The Institute for Government has done it, and I think it's likely to work pretty well. But in terms of the ministers, that they're not supposed to be experts on, they move around all the time, not supposed to be experts on particular policy areas. There's no point in trying to train them to do that. They're supposed to be able to make judgments on the basis of what the civil servants put to them and outsiders put to them. And they also need to focus on actually delivering things, making things happen rather than just coming up with great policy ideas. So I don't think there's much training you can do on that as preparing them for it, and once they get in, hoping the civil service will help them and not simply present reasons why things can't be done. Can I say something about the mayors too? Because I actually think it's the reason we started introducing elected mayors was we thought it was a really positive thing to do. And the experience in the United States is that most new policy ideas that are of interest come from governors or mayors. That's where they're tried out first in individual states or individual cities, and then they get adapted to the federal level. I think the same will be here, that you'll find many of the most interesting ideas will be experienced there. So I think even if there are arguments about this, it would be a good way of having an argument about policy rather than about something else. And third point I just want to make is that there may be a low turnout here, but my job now is to go to conflict areas around the world. And we certainly made the election interesting as far as the world's concerned. The number of people who say to me with absolute disbelief, whether a guerrilla leader or a president or prime minister, they can't believe that Rishi Sunak's campaign is really made Britain famous for one thing, which is the worst campaign in world history.
Just on the minister's point, would you be supportive of ministers staying longer? Because if you take Gove, right, he has been one of the most successful ministers that the Conservatives had. His legacy is primarily in one department, which is the department he stayed in for the longest, which is Divvy, and they've moved him around a lot. And he's had a lot of quite promising starts and then not had time to deliver. That's a common challenge. Would you be arguing for Keir to stick with people when they're competent for as long as possible?
We moved people around a lot, so we certainly didn't do that. Yes, there is a case for people staying for longer to become a bit more expert in the subject. David Cameron actually kept people for really quite a long time when he was Prime Minister. I'm not sure you can point to huge increases in the quality of policy making as a result, but I think Gove is fairly sui generis. So finding, for example, actually, if you put Wes and leave Wes in health for a full term, that would be really quite interesting to see what he produced by the end of it.
Can I just comment on that? I mean, Nick Gibb is a great example of someone who stayed in the school's brief for so long and drove through those, the changes in education so that more schools were hitting good or outstanding, children reading performance improved dramatically. I think he was a perfect example of why If it ain't broke, don't change it, you know, stick with what you've
What
got.
was interesting about it was if you did it from a junior ministerial
Yeah.
position, not from a secretary of state level. If you had like an Andrew Lansley in position, you wouldn't necessarily go on, you've given them there for 5 years.
I'd never argue that.
Harris, I'm going to bring you on any of those, maybe the mayor's one. There's also a wider question there of like, where will the internal challenge for Labour, where will the ideas and the kind of challenge come from in a particular thing at different majority?
Before we'll get into that, I actually wanted to come in on the how we do elections better, because I do think some of the leaders' debates, was it 45 seconds?
Yeah.
That's it. I just don't see how you can have a sensible conversation that informs anybody in that length of time. Why didn't we have different, you know, given there are so many debates, why didn't we theme them around different topics? You know, how do we do the net zero transition fairly, for example? But the other thing I think is worth drawing on is that it's been a strange election in a way, because the Conservatives with their policy are trying to bolster a base. It's quite a defensive set of policy positions I think they put forward. Farage, I'm not sure even knows the policies in the Reform Manifesto. That's not his mode of politics. And yet Labour's instincts are normally to talk about policy all the time. And so I think there's something there for the progressive side of the spectrum to think about in terms of how progressives do politics and how they communicate it. Harry and I were actually in Berlin last week and speaking to lots of incumbent politicians across Europe. And the thing that came up time and time again is that they were like, we're doing these great policies, but we're not getting rewarded for it. And I think that could become a really big issue for a Labour government if they don't get very good at effectively communicating what they're doing, but also thinking about politics as more than policy. What did you want me to answer with that? Where is the challenge?
Where's the challenge and ideas coming from the party?
I mean, like I said, I think there is there's a big agenda there within the Labour manifesto, and so I think there will need to be a focus on kind of how do you actually achieve that, how do you move forward on planning reform, etc. I do think that honeymoon period might not be that long, and it will come around quite quickly that they'll need to demonstrate really tangible effects on people's lives. Lots of the industrial policy and growth policy may be very effective, but it's probably not going to pay off in that first 1 to 2 years. And so they're going to need to think of kind of concrete policies that affect change. I think there is quite a good ecosystem of ideas in the progressive space. Obviously, we're IPPR, do lots of work that would like them to take up. But I think there is quite a good ecosystem, and then you also have the different currents of thought within the party. Others may disagree with me on this panel, but I don't think the party should shut down those different sources of ideas. Instead, we need to have that debate about what the kind of renewal programme is.
Great. I'm going to take another round of questions. So the lady in green on the front, just here.
Hi there, Olivia O'Sullivan from the Chatham House's UK Rural Programme. Had a couple of questions on the foreign affairs side. So, Karis, you talked about what's come up in the campaign, and one of the things we were kind of surprised about the emphasis on in a way was defence. The Tories opened the campaign with national security policy, and the kind of fights between the parties about who is going to spend 2% of GDP, but sort of more broadly, both parties seem to have identified this theme of who is arguing about who is going to be a guarantor of security, and this the sense that people feel more insecure in the world. As Jonathan was saying, with Labour when they come in, it's straight away NATO, European political community. Do either of you sense that Labour have a kind of positive agenda on foreign policy, or do you feel they will kind of just be immediately hit by quite a lot of events, including the US election, like tiny part B? I think to Katie, the interesting thing about reform, particularly Farage, is there's this odd way in which he's often soft on Putin, and it seems like, given the political consensus on Ukraine, I don't know, question to you, what foreign policy tradition does reform belong to, and are they enticing any conservative? Are they going to entice any conservative voters over, or with that? Like, what do you think the classic conservative base response to that would be?
Great, I'll take a round. Liv, one of our trustees.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Liv. I'm one of those trustees, and I also head up the Mayor of London's Violence Reduction Unit. And my question was about emissions. And it was about whether they're a good idea, how you make them happen most effectively, and struck by the notion that, I think, Jonathan, it was you that said that, you know, most of your time is going to be spent reacting, and obviously that requires a much more sort of forward-thinking way and different way, I think, of doing government.
Great, and then Jade on the other side of the room, and we'll get another round in, so keep your hands at the ready.
Hi, Jay Zim from WK Strategy. To what extent is this actually nothing to do with the current context and parties? And lest we forget that Boris also got a massive majority with significant swings. Are we actually just in an era of disloyal swing voters? And will the next election just be a swing back? And is it just a matter of tribal politics? Quite.
I'll take one more, so forth, just to the microphone.
Yeah, hi, I'm Matthew Pam, I'm from the Centre for Social Justice. I should also say I was a Brexit Party MP and worked with Farage, but I'm not at all a reform supporter. My question is really about presidential politics and Westminster politics. And I think it's a reflection of what the question we just had about swing. It seems to me that the thing that Farage has more than anything else, and he certainly had when I know him, is tremendous empathy with what people are thinking. And I'm interested to know what the panel think about what seems to be one of the great questions of this election is about disaffection, and how do we rebuild our democracy at a time when Western democracies that seems to be already struggling.
So I'm going to start again with you, John. Can I start with the volatility question, and in particular, I kind of add to it to say, how lent are those votes? How soft is that? However strong Labour's final performance is, like how sturdy is that coalition?
Okay, I mean, the general point one can make is that, you know, it's long been demonstrated that voters are less likely to have long-term loyalties than they once were, and the potential, though it won't always be realised, the potential for high volatility is always there. Of course, what happens, however, also depends on the supply side of politics. And basically, we are where we are because of two major political shocks. And I'm going to make myself unpopular now. My own personal view is that we are where we are primarily because of disaffection of the Conservatives, rather than because of the changes that Keir Starmer made, etc., etc. That's a secondary part of the story. There are basically only two crucial periods in the last 5 years. It is the 6 weeks in the wake of the immediate first stories about Partygate, when the Tories lost 6 points in 6 weeks. And for the first time, do remember in this room, for the first 2 years of this parliament, the Conservatives were never, ever consistently behind Labour in the polls, which is one of the best electoral records of any incumbent government in recent parliaments, right? It is Partygate #1 that destroys the Conservative Party, and and all of which is we know about. And then of course #2 is Liz Truss, Liz. And no government in the modern era that's presided over a market crisis, see the financial crash of 2008 to 9, the IMF crisis, the devaluation crisis of 1967, Black Wednesday, no government that's presided over a market crisis has survived at the ballot box, even if, as in the case of John Major's government, that inaugurated a brilliant period of economic growth and no inflation, right? The voters do not forget and they do not forgive. And so the volatility is a function of what happened. Those are, this government has managed two major shocks and got rid of two prime ministers. So that's the crucial thing to realise about where we are. Now it follows from what I've just said that I'm also in the camp that says it's not that much enthusiasm for what Labour are offering. They've not really sealed the deal. And just bear in mind, and I think anybody who's a Labour supporter really needs to think about this. It is possible that the Labour Party will get 450 seats on less than 40% of the vote. You will have to realise that your mandate, or rather, your endorsement from the electorate will be highly limited and very much dependent on simply a section of the electorate. And that you must not assume that your dominance in the House of Commons is a reflection of the position in the wider public domain. Can I then come up to what the gentleman just said here? Absolutely right. If you listen to what Nigel Farage said in the launch of his party's manifesto, and I'm sorry, I just can't do it. I don't have the same quality that he has. But if you listen to that, he just articulated the way in which so many people feel at the moment about the fact that the country seems to be broken, that their living standard is not improving, they're not sure if the health service is going to be able to look after them, they're not quite sure that the future of their children is going to be as good as they've experienced, etc., let alone the geostrategic situation that's already been referred to. We are looking at a deeply discontented, concerned electorate, and Farage can just emote it. He can use the words that articulate well, whereas frankly, neither on the Labour side nor the Conservative side are they very good at it. The Conservative Party are desperately coming up with policy after policy after policy, which add up to nothing. I mean, actually, ironically, the mistake that Sunak is making is the same mistake that Corbyn made. Corbyn had loads and loads of policies in 2019, but the whole was less than the sum of the parts. There was no the Corbynites thought, if you get all these policies, blah, 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 people will vote you. No. You've got to have a broad message. And equally on the Labour side, you know, don't say anything that might cut across what has been agreed. As a result, there is so little spontaneity, so little ability, which is crucial to the art of politics, of being able to reach people and talk with people, not talk at people.
Jonathan, I might come to you on Labour's foreign policy. Is there a positive vision here?
Well, the first thing I think is that new prime ministers come in not very interested in foreign policy, not knowing much about foreign policy, and not being elected on foreign policy. It's only true of Tony Blair, it's true of Mrs. Thatcher, not so true of David Cameron. But normally, prime ministers come in, they're not focused on it, but they find out quite quickly they need to be focused on it. It happens to them. And they have to learn that. I think David Lammy, to his credit, has tried to set out, he did an article in Foreign Affairs, etc., setting out ideas on foreign policy, which I thought were pretty coherent, and showed someone who actually had thought about his job before taking it, which is encouraging. I think the main thing that will stand out with an incoming Labour government will be reaching out to Europe. They will have to do that, and I think Europe is hoping that they will, and they've offered to cooperate on security, etc. I remember in '97, it was after the beef war where John Major had walked away from EU meetings, and there was a huge sense of relief when we came into government. They thought finally there was going to be a chance to cooperate. I remember we went to see Chancellor Kohl in Bonn very early on. I was in the queue hanging outside the Kanzleramt to meet him, and he came up to me and said, "Oh, the good pal, not the bad pal." This brother called Charles, who wrote the Bruges speech and who worked with Mrs. Thatcher for 8 years. So there is this sort of wave you can ride in terms of it gives you an opportunity anyway in Europe. So I think that will stand out. The second thing is the defence review. That there will have to be a pretty serious defence review, given the mess that defence is in at the moment, and given the need to actually spend more on it over the course of the Parliament. And then the third problem that the Labour government's going to have an idea about is the Trump administration coming in. If you are going to face a Trump administration, yes, it's a good idea, as David Lammy has, to try and reach out to people around Trump like JD Vance, but that's not going to save you in the long term. You're going to need to reinsure with the Europeans, so we have an alternative if there's a not very friendly US administration.
Thank you. Karis, I'm going to come to you. If you want to add anything on the foreign policy, we've just launched obviously our international representative, so it's a good time to talk about it. And then the missions question, maybe.
Thanks. And then I will repeat what Jonathan said, which I completely agree with. But on the kind of foreign policy question, I mean, if both parties are framing their manifestos around the concept of security, you know, that's clearly coming through from voters in some forum. But also, I think this could be a really turbulent parliament in terms of the geopolitical shifts that are taking place, and they will need to grapple with that. I think there are a few, you know, there are the events that are going to hit them. There's the issues Jonathan has talked about. Beyond that, I think there is also a sense from Lammy and his team of re-becoming good global citizens. So an emphasis on multilateralism, thinking about what Britain can do to counter kleptocracy. We hosted David Lammy talking about that recently, rethinking the relationship with the global south and resetting that, and re-establishing the UK's role as a leader in climate diplomacy. To keep their eye on those prizes is going to be pretty challenging given the things that are going to hit them, but I think there is quite a kind of forward-looking reset moment there. Just briefly on the missions, I do think they're a good idea for the reason that, you know, clearly working across departments is incredibly important, but not just departments, also working across different stakeholders in the economy and society to achieve those really ambitious aims. I think missions are intended to support that different kind of working. I think some academics would say that only really the clean energy mission is a true mission. And so I think there might need to be some early work to kind of make sure that the missions that are set out are properly set up. And then it's how much attention Keir Starmer gives them and the leadership that he gives them that will make them work. But
And so, the story in the FT about mission boards, I think that's really quite interesting. So their intention clearly is to have bodies at the centre doing this with Keir Starmer having a role within that. So they are looking at ways to make the missions a way of organising government. The trouble with the missions are not trouble. The fact is they're very different sorts of things. Growth is not the same as building 1.5 billion houses. 0.5 billion houses requires a certain sort of mission structure, probably involving people in the private sector and consultants and so on. Growth is what the whole government's about. So they're very different sort of things. But having a way of organising your key priorities and having them done from the centre, it makes good sense.
She's in line for our recommendations. So, Katie, there was a question about reform and conservatives in foreign policy, particularly.
Yeah, I think it's a great question actually, because I think it attracts as many people as it turns on. And you've got a number of people that I felt that, and some people were saying this on the doorstep, Tory MPs were saying to me that they felt that the moment the shine came off Farage a little bit for some Conservative voters that were absolutely happy to ditch the Conservatives and vote reform was when basically he's just shining a light on his comments around Putin and Ukraine. That was just beyond the pale for them. And I think that was helpful for a number of Conservative voters to think, oh, I just got to think twice about this guy. But saying that, there are lots of people out there, and reflecting what you said, John, earlier about the fact that he's talking their language, who believe, why the hell is my cash going to Ukraine? Now I can sit here for the next hour and persuade you why that is absolutely the right thing to do. But we are in the Westminster bubble. We are in the Westminster Village right now. We listen to these arguments all the time. We read we read informed opinion and we come up with our own set of values from that. They don't have that out there. They are hard pressed. They are working 3 jobs. They are trying to keep the show on the road. They can't afford the mortgage hike. They can't afford the energy bills, the food bills. And they're thinking, well, why is my money going to immigrants? And why is my money going to Ukraine? Why is my money going here? And why is my money going there? And Farage taps into that. But he does tap in often to these issues with no solution. And you can brilliantly do that when you are a voice from the side. And unlike other wonderful characters in politics, whether you like them or you don't, and you think they've performed or they haven't, Boris Johnson is another one where you can still walk around and he's like the Pied Piper. People still want to spend time with him. They want to go for a pint with him. They think that he's one of them, even though he's anything but. And so we are lacking big characters in politics, and that's why the Farages of this world stand out. But we do have to hold them to account. And we do have to say to them, well, what's your solution for this? And what's your argument for that? And it's all very well newspapers with slashing on Farage's comments, but without challenging him, we are really giving Farage a free ride. And I think that's bad for democracy. I would say, on reflection to an earlier question that links this about big players and characters in government, why would you want to be a politician right now? When you are trolled, when you are spat out the street, when your children are picked on at school, when you could earn more money in the private sector, and it is no fun whatsoever. And we should be thankful and grateful that people do, because we do not want to be in a scenario where people do not understand for put themselves forward for election. But the problem is, what I've seen over a number of years is when I entered politics 25 years ago, these were serious big hitters. And maybe I was younger and more impressed and less cynical. But wow, did I want to be in their company? Wow, did I want to hear from them? Did I want to learn from them? Did I know that they were going to go on and run major businesses and do really well just in their business career, just as much as they did in the world of politics? We are, and you're looking at one, a former councillor going to 12 years in the London Borough. We are hiring lots of ex-councillors to become your future MPs who can talk to you about the dog mess on the pavement and aren't so great at international policy. And that worries me. So we need to be really careful around, the kind of people who are making some of those judgments and advising, listening to their civil servants and taking that advice, because you've got to be able to do that. And I'm not sure our parliamentary makeup in the last few years, or maybe what might return after this election has got, got as many big hitters as really we should have. And maybe that's what we get what we deserve because of the way we treat them.
I'm going to take a very, very quick fire round. So like very quick questions only. The gentleman on the right.
My question
Is
is,
a microphone.
hi there. My question is, you've got a really good panel here, different backgrounds and talents. And maybe it's not all over for Rishi, you still got what, 8 days left? So if you were kind of dropped in as kind of a crack team, trying to save.
What we needed.
What would you go for? And if I could get away with the one slightly different one, you're also dropped in at the other end with Keir Starmer, who actually says, you know what, I actually don't think my plans are good enough. I actually need exponential growth, not really good growth. We need double-digit growth every single year because we're in the middle of all sorts of geopolitical, competition. And what are you going to advise him? Where are you going to send him? So,
I'm actually going to leave that as our last question. So,
Great
so very
question.
good ending question. So one piece of advice for Rishi, one piece of advice for Keir, each of the panel to go. I'm going to start with you, John.
I mean, to Starmer, I think is to look seriously at the plans for declined investment in capital infrastructure in the next 3 years. And insofar as you want to find leeway in the very tight fiscal noose, probably the area where the market is going to be most willing to allow you to increase borrowing is with respect to capital infrastructure, and thereby also perhaps rather increase your ability to engage to achieve the growth that you have. I mean, that at the moment just seems an enormous gap in their position. To be honest, on Sunak, I mean, to be honest, it's too late. You're not going to turn around a campaign like that at this stage. The fundamental mistakes were made by Boris and by Liz Truss. But insofar as they tried to turn it around, the fundamental mistakes they made were last autumn by believing that one, tax cuts, and two, a focus on immigration would be able to turn things around. And some of us could have told them, no, this is not going to work. You need to focus on the health service and you need to focus on trying to improve the economy. And those are the two things that the party has really not wanted to focus on, perhaps because in the end, they just regarded them as too intractable.
I'm going to ask Hannah to be brief.
Okay, really quickly. I agree with Jonathan that Keir Starmer needs to be really bold in government, but also can probably afford to strengthen his mandate a little bit more between now and then. So that soft kind of, we don't quite know what you're going to do, and therefore you don't have the mandate for it, I think should be a worry, that you reflected on, John, as well. So he maybe can afford to just put a little bit more meat on the bones between now and then. And yes, you might say, well, we might lose X seats because of that, but actually we would have a stronger mandate to govern. So he can afford to take a risk. I agree with you, you can't rescue the Conservatives campaign, but the indecision, the reason why we're just talking before we started this panel on why Keir Starmer has moved quickly today to suspend a candidate that's bet on his own seat, but bet against him winning, which sounds bonkers, but that's not insider trading. That's not someone that's had some kind of information in any way. It's just someone who bet against himself, which is a dumb thing to do, but doesn't necessarily break rules. Why has Starmer done it? Because he's trying to point out that Rishi hasn't done it. And it's a weakness, and it's a decision, and it's bad leadership. And eventually he'll be brought to it because he always does, because eventually he'll be pushed in the right direction. And so the only thing you can advise Rishi, I'm running out of time, the only thing you can advise Rishi is that, make a decision and get on with it.
Chris?
John's kind of said what I was going to say on advice for Keir, although I do think, double digit might be a little bit ambitious, even for those missions. But I think thinking carefully about the institutional architecture around how we make decisions about what and how much to invest could be a really important step on that journey. In terms of Rishi Sunak, I mean, maybe put that genie that Keir Starmer seems to have back in the bottle. But more seriously, I think, there is, I think it's fairly clear they're not going to win. And so what is at stake is the future of the Conservative Party. And what matters, therefore, is thinking about that future. And there's a danger that if they just try and throw everything at a defensive strategy, that starts and very shaky foundations.
Final word.
Thanks. Okay, well, I mean, it's much the same as others in that what I would focus on if I was here now is the mandate. How do I get a mandate that is a positive mandate, so that when things get difficult, I can point back to that. And as John said earlier, it's not about lots of small policies. 97, we had very few detailed policies. What we had was a sense of vision. It's very clear what we were trying to do. Therefore, we were able to do it.
Can we change that in the next few days?
You can, if you make a really big speech before the election, you can still do that. I mean, it's not going to change the vote, but what you can do is change the mandate that you get. You can try and define it in that way. Is it a little bit late to be trying to?
Does he have the skill, Jonathan? Does he have the skill?
It's to be seen. Let's see. The
Very diplomatic.
yeah,
It's like 4 years, and it's not happened.
But what I do want to pick up is one other thing John said on this, which is I've had Tory MPs say, "No, if Keir Starmer wins with less than 40%, he's only got 38%, then he's not really legitimate, and that's going to cause all sorts of trouble with this." That's the way our system works. Tony Blair several times didn't have 40% of the vote, but I think I'm right in saying your posters will know.
Yeah, 2005, you only won because the electoral system operated very strongly in your favour.
Exactly, that is the electoral system. This is not Maduro trying to cheat in Venezuela. This is how our system works. If the small parties go up, the big parties go down. If it's a race between the big parties, as in Boris Johnson's victory, then small parties get crushed. And that doesn't affect the legitimacy of the Prime Minister. So that won't affect his mandate. What affects his mandate is whether or not he can actually set up what that is. In terms of Rishi, the only thing I can think of is maybe pop around the US Embassy and see if we could get that green card back.
Yeah. Right. Thank you, everyone. I'm sorry I couldn't get to everyone's questions, but I'm sure you can collar our panel. There are drinks and snacks in the back. Thank you to In-House for hosting. Thank you to our amazing panel for all of our the insight. And we will see